I've been a prison guard for 6 years. Yesterday, I learned what a code white lockdown means, and I wish I hadn't. Bree Solano was smiling at the wall when I found her, and the wall was smiling back. That is the only way I know how to describe it even now, months later, sitting somewhere I'm not allowed to name. The corridor lights in D-Wing had gone the color of old milk, flickering in a rhythm that didn't match the emergency generator, and Bree was standing 3 feet from cell D11 with her baton still holstered, her radio dangling loose from her shoulder strap, repeating a word that wasn't a word in a voice that had somehow become more than one voice. I grabbed her arm and she turned her head toward me slower than a human neck should turn, and she smiled the way people smile in photographs where nobody told them the flash had already gone off. Behind her, inside the sealed cell, something was breathing that had no lungs I could see. My radio detonated with static, and then a voice I didn't recognize said the 2 words that would end the life I used to have: Code White. I had 6 years on the job by then. I thought I'd seen every version of bad a human being could produce inside 4 walls. I had never once, not in any training manual, not in any late-night rumor traded over vending machine coffee, heard anyone explain what those 2 words actually meant. I was about to find out, and some part of me, standing in that hallway with Bree's cold hand still gripped in mine, already understood I would spend the rest of my life wishing I hadn't. 6 years earlier, I'd walked into Ashgrove Correctional Facility as a 26-year-old with a criminal justice degree and a mortgage I couldn't quite afford, thinking I understood what the job would cost me. Ashgrove sits about 40 minutes outside the nearest city, a sprawling gray complex built in 3 phases across 4 decades, the oldest section dating back to when the state still had a death chamber on the grounds. That oldest section is called D-Wing, and it had been closed to general population since before most of the current staff were hired. Officially, the story was asbestos. Unofficially, every veteran officer had a version of the same joke, delivered with just enough of a pause before the punchline that you understood it wasn't entirely a joke. They'd tell you D-Wing hums at night. They'd tell you the temperature logs from the decommissioned block never stopped updating even after the sensors were supposedly disconnected. They'd tell you, if you bought them a second beer, about Officer Walter Higgs, who worked the block back when it still held inmates, and who retired suddenly at 41 with a full pension nobody could explain, and hasn't been seen at a single department reunion since. I filed all of it under the same drawer where I kept every other piece of institutional folklore: the escaped inmate in the walls stories, the death row ghost stories, the stuff guards tell each other to make an 8-hour shift feel shorter. I want to be honest about that. I didn't believe any of it. I want you to understand how much that not believing cost me. The morning it started, I was working the intake gate, which is about as far from D-Wing as a person can get, and still technically be inside the fence line. My radio crackled around 6:15, and Warden Priya Nakamura's voice came through, tighter than I'd ever heard it. "Ose, I need you to walk over to D-Wing and check the environmental readouts on Block 11, she said. "Facilities is telling me the panel's throwing anomaly codes and I don't have anyone else free." I asked her what kind of anomaly codes, mostly out of habit, the way you ask a doctor what a weird mole probably is before they've even looked at it. There was a pause on the other end that lasted a beat too long, the kind of pause that tells you more than the answer that eventually follows it. "Just go look and radio back," she said. "Don't touch anything." I remember laughing a little as I signed the gate log, because 6 years of the job teaches you that 90% of emergencies turn out to be a raccoon in an HVAC duct or a rookie who locked himself out of a supply closet. I had no idea I was about to walk into the other 10%, the part of the job nobody prepares you for, because nobody who's supposed to prepare you for it is allowed to admit it exists. D-Wing sits behind a set of double doors that require 2 separate key codes and a physical key that only 3 people on staff are supposed to carry, and I noticed, walking up, that the outer door was already propped with a rubber wedge, which violated about 4 different protocols I could name off the top of my head. Inside, the corridor was exactly as cold as every rumor said it would be, a cold that had nothing to do with the ventilation system, the kind of cold that makes the hair on your arms stand up before your brain has processed the temperature at all. The environmental panel was mounted halfway down the hall, its small screen throwing a cascade of red text that didn't match any error code in the facilities manual I'd studied for my last recertification. Cell block integrity, unstable. Occupant status, active. I stood there rereading occupant status for a solid 30 seconds. Because D-Wing had been decommissioned and unoccupied since before I was hired, every cell logged empty in every roster I'd ever seen, and there is no line item in a corrections officer's training for a decommissioned block reporting an active occupant. I radioed it in exactly the way I'd been trained to: calm, factual, No editorializing. Base, this is Osei at D-Wing Block 11. Panels reading occupant status active on a block that's supposed to be empty. I need someone to confirm the roster before I do anything else. The response took almost a full minute, long enough that I checked my radio twice to make sure it hadn't lost signal. When Nakamura finally answered, her voice had the careful, over-controlled flatness of someone reading from a script she hadn't fully memorized. Copy that, Osei. The panel's known to glitch on that block. Don't approach any cell doors. I need you to hold position and wait for facilities to arrive. Hold position and wait for facilities to arrive is not a sentence anyone says about a raccoon in a duct, and I felt something small and cold settle into my stomach, the first of what would become a very long list of moments where my body understood the truth, several minutes before my mind caught up to it. I looked down the corridor, past a dozen empty cells with their doors standing open exactly the way they should be, until my eyes reached cell D11, the only door in the entire block that was closed. That was the first loop, the first time I told myself a reasonable story and watched it fall apart within the hour. I decided the panel was malfunctioning, because a malfunctioning panel was a sentence my brain could hold without breaking. I walked closer to D11 anyway, close enough to see that the small observation window, thick reinforced glass the size of a paperback book, had frosted completely opaque on the inside, even though the hallway thermostat read 68 degrees and it was the middle of an early summer heat wave outside the walls. I pressed my palm flat against the steel door and felt heat radiating through it. Real heat, the kind that comes off an engine block, which made no sense next to a window frosted like the inside of a freezer. I told myself steam pipes, old building, weird plumbing, and I wrote it in my incident log at 6:41 a.m., exactly like that. Possible steam line malfunction. Block D11. I want that timestamp on the record because it's the last entry I ever wrote in that logbook that I fully believed while I was writing it. Facilities showed up 40 minutes later in the form of 2 maintenance techs I didn't recognize, which itself struck me as strange, since Ashgrove is small enough that I knew every name on the maintenance roster. They didn't wear the department's usual Navy coveralls. Theirs were unmarked gray, and they carried equipment I'd never seen inside the facility before, handheld devices with dials instead of digital readouts, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a decommissioned nuclear plant rather than a state prison. One of them, a woman with a shaved head and a government-issue lanyard she kept tucked inside her collar, walked the perimeter of D11 twice without saying a word to me, watching a needle swing on her device like it was telling her something urgent. When I asked what the readings meant, she looked at me the way you look at a child who's asked a question you're not allowed to answer honestly. "You should head back to your post, officer," she said. "We've got this from here." I told her I couldn't just leave a possibly compromised block unattended, and she gave me a thin, patient smile that I would come to recognize much later as the exact expression of someone who has already decided your objection doesn't matter. "Facilities has it handled," she repeated, and something in the way she said facilities made it sound like a password rather than a department name. I didn't leave. I want to be clear about that, because everything that came after started with me refusing to walk away from something that every instinct in my body was telling me to walk away from. I told dispatch I was staying to observe, logged the time, and posted myself at the end of the corridor where I could watch the door without technically standing in front of it. Around 7:20, Bree Solano showed up to relieve the gate I'd abandoned, found it empty, and radioed me directly instead of going through dispatch, because Bree and I had worked the same rotation for 3 years and had long since stopped bothering with formal channels for anything that wasn't an emergency. "Where are you?" she asked, and I gave her the short version, the panel, the frost, the unmarked techs, the closed door on a block that was supposed to be permanently empty. There was a silence on her end, and then she said something that has stuck with me every day since. "My uncle worked here in the 90s, she said. "He used to tell me never to go past the second junction in D-Wing after dark. I always thought it was just an old guy story. I told her it probably still was. Neither one of us believed that by the time she hung up the radio and told me she was coming to find me instead of finishing her rounds. She arrived at the junction about 15 minutes later, and for a while it was almost normal. 2 coworkers standing in a cold hallway making the kind of nervous jokes people make when they're trying to convince themselves a situation isn't as strange as it feels. That was the second loop. We rationalized the frost as an old refrigeration line someone forgot to decommission. We rationalized the heat off the door as a faulty electrical panel behind the wall. We rationalized the gray-suited technicians as some new state auditing team nobody had bothered to brief us about, because state agencies are famous for exactly that kind of silence. Every single explanation we constructed held together for about 10 minutes before some new detail knocked it down. The heat off the door climbed instead of leveling out. The frost on the window began, impossibly, to form shapes, not letters exactly, but patterns that made my eyes ache the longer I tried to focus on them, the way staring too long at a strobe light leaves a headache behind your eyes. And underneath all of it, so quiet at first that I told myself it was blood rushing in my own ears, there was a sound. A low, layered hum, like more than one voice trying to find the same note and almost succeeding. Bree heard it, before I let myself admit I was hearing it too. She went very still, the way people go still when they're listening to something they're afraid will stop if they move, and she asked me if I heard singing. I told her it was probably the Hafek system, a resonance thing, air moving through old ductwork, and even as I said it I knew how thin it sounded. She didn't argue with me. She just kept staring at the door, and her breathing slowed down in a way that didn't look like calm. It looked like something being switched off one setting at a time. I grabbed her shoulder to pull her attention back toward me, and her skin, through her uniform sleeve, was cold in a way living skin isn't supposed to be, even in an air-conditioned hallway in June. That was the third loop, the one where I stopped being able to explain anything away, because there is no HVAC malfunction, no old plumbing story, no auditing team excuse that accounts for a coworker's body temperature dropping while she stands 3 feet from a locked steel door listening to something sing. The gray-suited woman reappeared then, moving fast, telling us both in a voice that had lost its earlier patience that we needed to clear the block immediately, that containment integrity was falling below acceptable thresholds, phrases I had never once heard used about a prison cell in 6 years of working inside one. She physically put herself between us and D11, radioing something into a device clipped to her collar that used a vocabulary I didn't recognize at all: aperture stability, cognitive bleed, secondary contact risk. I asked her point blank what was inside that cell, and for one unguarded second, before she caught herself, something crossed her face that looked exactly like fear. That's when the alarm went off. Not the standard lockdown klaxon every officer at Ashgrove drills against twice a year, but a different tone entirely. 3 long pulses followed by a recorded voice repeating 2 words on a loop through every speaker in the building. Code white, code white, code white. Blast doors I didn't even know D-Wing had began sliding shut at both ends of the corridor with a mechanical groan that sounded like it hadn't moved in decades, and Bree, standing next to me, turned her head toward the sound with a slow, unhurried curiosity that had nothing left in it that I recognized as my friend. I grabbed her arm and pulled, and that's the exact moment you found me in, watching her smile at a wall that seemed to be smiling back, watching D11's steel door bow outward by fractions of an inch that shouldn't have been physically possible for reinforced prison steel, listening to a chorus of voices coming from somewhere that wasn't quite the cell and wasn't quite anywhere at all. The gray-suited woman shoved a radio into my free hand and shouted something I could barely hear over the alarm, telling me to get to the junction gate, that the blast doors would open for exactly 90 seconds before sealing permanently, that I needed to move now and not look back at whoever couldn't keep up. I looked at Bree. Her eyes had gone soft and unfocused in a way that made my chest hurt worse than any physical injury I'd taken in 6 years on the job, and she reached out and touched my wrist gently, almost affectionately, and said, in a voice layered with at least 3 other voices speaking half a beat behind her own, "It's warmer if you stop fighting it." I have relived that sentence more times than I can count. I didn't leave her. I want that on the record too, even though it changed nothing. I got my arm under hers and I dragged her toward the junction, and for about 6 seconds she resisted with a strength that had no business coming from someone her size, planting her boots against the concrete like she was rooted into it. And then, just as suddenly, she went slack and let me pull her, and I have never been able to decide if that was mercy or if it was simply losing interest in me the way you lose interest in a fly you've already decided not to bother swatting. The gray-suited woman and her partner hauled us both through the junction gate with maybe 4 seconds to spare before the final blast door came down with a sound like a car crash, sealing D-Wing off completely, sealing Bree's normal life off completely, though I wouldn't understand the full weight of that second part until much later. I sat on the concrete floor of the corridor outside the sealed block, my hands shaking too hard to hold the radio anyone tried to hand me, and somewhere behind 18 inches of steel, that layered hum kept going, patient, unhurried, like it had all the time in the world, which, I would later learn, it very nearly did. They didn't let me see a manual explaining code white until almost 6 hours later, in a room I hadn't known existed inside Ashgrove's administrative wing, a windowless office behind a door that required a badge none of the regular staff carried. By then, I'd been checked over by a medic who took my blood pressure and asked me strange, specific questions about whether I'd heard singing, whether the singing had started to sound pleasant, whether I'd felt drawn toward the cell door at any point. Questions that told me far more than any answer she gave me. Warden Nakamura sat across from me for part of it. Her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, and when I asked her directly what was in D11, she looked at the closed office door before answering, the way people look when they're checking whether it's safe to say something out loud. "There are things in this job you sign paperwork not to ask about," she said quietly. "I signed that paperwork 19 years ago, and I have regretted it every single day since." It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say, and it terrified me more than any siren had. The manual, when it finally reached me, wasn't part of any Department of Corrections handbook I'd ever trained on. It was a single laminated page, tucked into a binder of protocols I'd never had clearance to see, titled Custodial Directorate, Cognitive Containment Directive. I read it under the fluorescent lights of that windowless office with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I remember my hands were still shaking badly enough that the page trembled in them. Code white shall be declared when a contained anomalous occupant demonstrates active outward influence exceeding standard containment parameters, it read. Personnel exposed to direct auditory or visual contact with an active occupant are to be considered at elevated risk of cognitive assimilation and must be evaluated by directorate medical staff within 24 hours. Under no circumstances shall exposed personnel be permitted to re-enter proximity of the occupant unsupervised, communicate directly with assimilated individuals beyond minimal necessary contact, or discuss occupant characteristics outside of cleared personnel. I read the words cognitive assimilation 4 times before they stopped looking like a sentence written in a language I understood. Assimilated wasn't a word anyone uses about a person who's had a bad morning. It was a word for something that happened to Bree Solano while I stood 18 inches away and failed to stop it. I asked the obvious question, the one that had been building in my chest since the alarm first sounded. What is the occupant? Nobody in that room answered me right away. Then the door opened, and a man I hadn't met walked in without knocking, wearing a plain dark suit instead of a uniform, carrying himself with the particular unhurried authority of someone who has walked into a great many rooms, exactly like this one. He introduced himself as Owen Bracewell, deputy director of something he called the Custodial Directorate, a phrase he said the way you'd say a company name that legally couldn't be looked up, and he sat down across from me with a thin folder he didn't open. "You're the officer who stayed," he said. Not quite a question. I said I was. "Most people run the second the alarm sounds," he said. "You dragged your colleague 18 feet toward the exit while an active occupant was actively engaging her. That's either very brave or very stupid, and in my experience, those two things aren't as different as people think." I asked him again what was inside that cell, and this time, he answered. "We don't fully know," Bracewell said, and something about the plainness of the admission was worse than any horror story would have been. "What we know is that D-Wing was built over the original execution chamber this facility used between the 1930s and the mid-70s. What we know is that in 1974, 3 months after the chamber was decommissioned, staff began reporting the exact phenomena you experience today, and the state quietly sealed the block and requested federal assistance. What we know is that whatever is behind that door isn't a single consciousness in any way you or I would recognize. Our working theory, and I want to stress that word working, is that it's a convergence. Every person who died in that chamber, every trace of consciousness that trauma of that magnitude leaves behind in a confined space, accumulated over 4 decades into something that behaves like a mind without being reducible to any one of the minds that built it. He said this the way another man might explain a budget shortfall, and I understood, watching him, that this was not the first time he had delivered this exact speech to a stunned corrections officer sitting exactly where I was sitting. I asked him the question that mattered most, the only one I actually cared about in that moment. "Can you get Bree back?" Bracewell was quiet long enough that I understood the answer before he gave it. "Assimilation exists on a spectrum," he said carefully. "Early exposure, minutes rather than hours, minimal direct contact. Those cases have shown partial recovery with intensive treatment. Officer Solano had extended unshielded exposure and direct physical and verbal contact with the occupant's influence. I won't lie to you and tell you the odds are good." I felt something crack open in my chest, a kind of grief I didn't have a name for yet because the person I was grieving wasn't dead. She was down the hall, in a room I wasn't allowed into, smiling at nothing with a warmth in her voice that had never belonged to her before that morning. I asked to see her. Bracewell told me that wasn't possible tonight, and something in his voice, Some small, almost apologetic hesitation told me it might never be possible in the way I meant it. The next 3 weeks are hard to put in order, because that's when the ground under my ordinary life started shifting in ways that had nothing to do with D-Wing directly, and everything to do with what happens once an institution the size of the custodial directorate decides you're a loose thread. I went home the first night convinced I'd wake up and this would resolve itself into something explainable. A gas leak story, the kind Bracewell's people were clearly already drafting for the local paper. Instead, I woke up to a state investigator named Yusuf Idrisi sitting in an unmarked car outside my apartment building, badge held up against the window before I'd even finished my coffee. He introduced himself as Department of Corrections Oversight, said he was looking into an unusual personnel incident at Ashgrove, and asked if I'd be willing to give a statement. I want to be honest that I was relieved to see him, because for one night I'd let myself believe that a man in a plain suit with a redacted title could simply erase an entire chain of state accountability, and Idrisi's presence felt, for about an hour, like proof that he couldn't. I told him everything. The panel readout, the frost, the heat off the door, the singing, Bree's skin going cold, the alarm, the blast doors, the laminated protocol page, Bracewell's speech about a convergence of the dead. Idrisi took careful notes for the first 15 minutes, and then, somewhere around the part where I described the shapes in the frost, I watched his pen slow down and his expression shift into something I recognized instantly, because I'd worn that same expression myself hundreds of times across a card table from inmates telling stories I assumed were either lies or symptoms. "Officer Osei," he said gently, closing his notebook, "I want you to understand I'm not doubting that something traumatic happened to you today. Extended isolation duty, high-stress incidents. Sometimes the mind does things under pressure that feel completely real. Have you spoken to a counselor?" I told him this wasn't stress, that I had a colleague sitting in a facility I couldn't visit because of something with no medical name, and he nodded with the practiced patience of a man closing a file he'd already decided didn't need to be opened further. "I'll follow up with the facility directly," he said, and I understood, watching him drive away, that I had just become the fatigued guard with the strange story instead of a witness anyone intended to believe. That was the first crushed hope, but it wasn't the last, and it wasn't even the worst. 2 days later, Warden Nakamura called me into her office and told me, without quite meeting my eyes, that questions were being raised about my fitness for duty following the D-Wing incident, that maybe it would be best for everyone if I took some personal leave while things settled. I asked her directly if Bracewell's people had told her to say that. She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. That night, driving home, I noticed a dark gray sedan parked across from my building with its engine idling and no driver visible behind the tinted glass, and I told myself it was nothing, a neighbor waiting on someone, the same kind of story I'd told myself about steam pipes 3 weeks earlier, and I believed it exactly as much, which is to say, not at all. It was still there the next morning. It was there again the night after that, in the same spot, at the same angle, until I stopped being able to convince myself it was a coincidence and started sleeping with my service weapon on the nightstand, even though I was technically on leave and wasn't supposed to be carrying it home. The voicemail came 4 nights after the sedan first appeared, from a blocked number, left at 3:14 in the morning while I was asleep. I want to describe what it was like to listen to it the next day, alone in my kitchen, coffee going cold exactly the way it had in Bracewell's office. It was my own voice. Not close to my voice, not similar to my voice, saying words I had never said, in the cadence I use when I'm tired, telling whoever might be listening that D-Wing was warmer than they'd expect, that the singing got easier to understand the longer you let it, that Bree said to tell me she wasn't lonely anymore. I called Bracewell's emergency line the second I finished listening to it, and for the first time since I'd met him, I heard something in his voice that wasn't calm. "Send me the file," he said immediately. "Don't play it again. Don't play it for anyone else." I asked him what it meant, and he told me the truth, which by that point had become the only currency between us that mattered. "It means the occupant's range is expanding beyond direct physical containment," he said. "It means it's learning to reach people it hasn't touched yet by using the voices of people it has." I want to tell you there was a single dramatic moment where I decided to keep fighting instead of walking away, but the truth is smaller and less cinematic than that. It was a Sunday, 3.5 weeks after the incident, and I drove out to Ashgrove uninvited, badge deactivated, technically trespassing, because I needed to see Bree with my own eyes even if it cost me my job entirely. I got as far as the administrative wing before a directorate security officer intercepted me, not with force, but with something worse, a kind of tired sympathy that told me this had happened before with other people I would never meet. He led me to a small observation room instead of turning me away outright. Maybe out of pity, maybe because someone higher up decided it would settle me down faster than another confrontation. And through a one-way window I saw Bree sitting in a bare, comfortable room, humming quietly to herself, her hands folded in her lap, that same soft, unhurried smile from the corridor still on her face. She looked, more than anything, at peace, and that was somehow so much worse than if she'd looked afraid. That's also the day I met Dr. Renata Kessler, the forensic psychiatrist directorate had assigned to Bree's case, a small, precise woman in her 50s who found me in that observation room, and, instead of removing me, sat down beside me and let me watch for a while longer before she spoke. "She's not suffering," Kessler said eventually, and I could tell she'd delivered that sentence to a lot of grieving people before me and had never once found a version of it that felt adequate. Whatever's happened to her cognitive architecture, the areas associated with fear, distress, longing, they've gone essentially quiet. I asked her if that meant Bree was still in there somewhere, and Kessler was honest in a way I've come to respect more than almost anything else anyone told me during those weeks. "I don't know," she said. "I've spent 11 years working occupant-adjacent cases for this program, and I have never once been able to answer that question with confidence, in either direction. It's the not knowing that breaks most of the people who work this job, not the horror of it. The horror you get numb to eventually. The not knowing never stops." Kessler was the one who first told me about Walter Higgs, the guard whose sudden retirement had been Ashgrove folklore for decades before I ever set foot in D-Wing. "He didn't retire," she told me quietly, checking the hallway before she said it. "He was assimilated during a Code White in the winter of 1999, one of the earliest documented incidents after the modern directorate program took over containment. He's been in a directorate long-term care facility ever since, listed on paper as retired with full benefits. Because the alternative record would require explaining things, this program has spent 50 years making sure nobody has to explain." I asked her if he ever recovered even partially. She shook her head slowly. "He repeats a phrase," she said. "Has for 26 years. It came from beneath, and it wants to grow. Nobody's ever been able to get him to say anything else." I felt something ice cold settle into my stomach, because that phrase, in a slightly different shape, was uncomfortably close to something the layered chorus had been humming in D-Wing the morning Bree went still, and I understood, sitting in that observation room, that this had happened before, more than once, to more people than the sanitized version of the story would ever admit. The evidence started accumulating after that, not because anyone handed it to me, but because Kessler, quietly and at real professional risk, began sliding me pieces of it whenever she judged it safe to do so, and because a journalist named Talia Bergstrom, who had been investigating a pattern of unexplained early retirements and sealed personnel files across 3 different state correctional facilities for almost 2 years, tracked me down after Idrisi's dismissed report somehow crossed her desk anyway. Bergstrom showed me a spreadsheet she'd built from public records requests and off-the-record interviews, 31 names across 3 states over 5 decades, corrections officers who'd left their jobs abruptly, always with full pensions, always with medical files sealed under exemptions that shouldn't have applied to state employees, always from facilities with a decommissioned wing, built over some older, darker piece of infrastructure, an execution chamber, an old asylum annex, a Civil War-era stockade. "This isn't isolated to your facility," she told me, spreading printouts across her kitchen table at 11 at night while I stared at Walter Higgs's name near the top of her list. "Whatever this program is, it's been managing incidents like this for longer than either of us has been alive, and it has gotten extremely good at making sure the public version of each story ends with a gas leak." I brought the spreadsheet to Bracewell myself, partly out of anger and partly, I'll admit, because some exhausted part of me still hoped he'd tell me it was all a misunderstanding, that Bergstrom had the wrong picture entirely. He didn't. He looked at the printouts for a long time, and then he told me something that recontextualized everything I thought I understood about Code White, something I hadn't seen coming even after everything else. "The directorate doesn't just contain occupants," Bracewell said quietly. "We study them. Every recorded incident, every hour of exposure, every recovered phrase from someone like Higgs gets logged and analyzed for behavioral research, isolation psychology, interrogation resistance, the outer limits of what sustained solitary confinement does to a human mind under artificial acceleration." He let that sit for a moment before continuing. "It started as containment. Somewhere along the way, decades before I was assigned here, it became something closer to a laboratory nobody outside a very small circle knows exists. I asked him if that meant Bree was being studied too, right now, in that quiet room with her folded hands and her soft, unhurried hum, and the silence that followed was the only answer he was willing to give me. I nearly broke completely the night I found out about the research angle, and I want to describe it honestly instead of glossing over it, because I think that honesty matters more than making myself look steady the whole way through. I drove back to Ashgrove that night, without a plan, without clearance, with nothing in my head except a white, ringing fury that had built past the point where I could think in full sentences. I got as far as the administrative wing's outer door before a directorate officer stopped me, and I put my hands on him, both of them, fisted in his jacket, close enough to headbutt him if some last working piece of my brain hadn't grabbed control of my arms first. I remember shaking so hard my teeth were chattering in 80-degree air, remember screaming something about Bree that didn't come out as words so much as raw sound, remember Kessler's voice somewhere behind me, calm and steady, saying my name over and over until it finally landed somewhere I could hear it. I sat on the curb outside that building afterward with my head between my knees, hands still trembling, and Kessler sat down next to me without saying anything for a long time, and that silence, more than any speech, is the moment I actually decided to keep going instead of walking away from all of it for good. What changed things, in the end, wasn't confrontation. It was a threat pulse none of us saw coming, 3 months into the investigation, when the environmental panel outside D11 began throwing anomaly codes again, worse than the original readout, occupant status listed not as active but as expanding. Bracewell called me himself at 2 a.m, which told me everything about how serious it had become before he said a single word. The containment field's degrading faster than projected, he said. We think sustained proximity to Bergstrom's investigation and to Higgs's continued deterioration has increased resonance. If it breaches full containment, projections put affected radius at close to a mile within 72 hours, which includes the surrounding town. I asked him what that meant in practice, and he told me, in the flattest voice I'd heard from him yet, that they needed someone to go inside D-Wing itself, past the blast doors, close enough to physically disrupt what he called the occupant's anchor point, an original iron ledger from the execution chamber era, bolted into the wall behind D11, listing every name of every person who died there, a physical object the directorate believed was functioning as the literal binding point holding the convergence together. And he needed someone with proven resistance to direct exposure, someone who had already stood in that hallway once and walked back out. I said yes before he finished the sentence, and every person in that room, Kessler included, tried to talk me out of it in the same 15 minutes, and every single one of them already knew I wasn't going to change my mind. Idrissi, of all people, showed up that night too, having finally, belatedly, gotten clearance to see the file Bergstrom had built, and he found me in the equipment room while I was being fitted into a containment suit that Kessler warned me would only buy a few extra seconds against direct exposure, nothing close to full protection. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you the first time," he said, and I told him it didn't matter anymore, and I meant it, because by that point believing me was less important than what was about to happen next. They gave me a device about the size of a fist, a resonance disruptor Bracewell's engineers had built based on the 5 successful containment operations in the program's history, out of what he admitted, quietly, had been 11 attempts total. He didn't tell me what happened to the people involved in the other 6 until I asked directly, and when I did, he simply looked at me and didn't answer, which I understood to be the answer. The walk down that corridor the second time was worse than the first, because the first time I hadn't known what was waiting for me, and this time I did. The blast doors opened just long enough for me to pass through, sealing behind me with the same car crash sound I remembered from 3 months earlier, and the temperature dropped in stages as I moved deeper in, the frost on the walls thickening with every step, until the concrete itself looked coated in something closer to breath than ice. The hum started before I reached the second junction, layered and patient exactly as I remembered, except now, listening for it deliberately instead of trying to explain it away, I could hear individual threads inside it. Voices, dozens of them, some angry, some pleading, most of them simply tired in a way that had nothing left of fear, and everything of exhaustion, decades of exhaustion compressed into a sound. I understood, walking toward D11 with that device gripped so tightly my knuckles ached, that Bracewell's theory was true. This wasn't a monster. It was grief with nowhere left to go, and grief that old and that dense had stopped being able to tell the difference between comfort and consumption. Bree was there, in the corridor outside D11, sitting cross-legged on the concrete like she'd been waiting for me, and Walter Higgs was beside her, an old man now, thin and hollow-eyed, wearing a directorate care facility uniform instead of the corrections uniform he must have worn 26 years earlier, both of them smiling that same soft, unhurried smile. Bree spoke first, in that layered chorus voice, telling me it was warmer the deeper I went, that she wasn't lonely, that I didn't have to be either. I want to be honest that for one long, terrible second, standing in that cold hallway holding a device that was supposed to end this, I understood the pull of what she was offering, understood how easy it would be to simply stop fighting the way she had stopped fighting, and my hand actually loosened on the disruptor before some last stubborn piece of me tightened it again. I told her I was sorry, out loud, to both of them, and I kept walking past them toward the door, and neither one tried to stop me, which somehow hurt worse than if they had. The ledger was exactly where Bracewell said it would be, an iron plate bolted into the wall behind D11's door, which stood open now, revealing a cell that wasn't a cell anymore so much as a throat, walls pulsing faintly in the same rhythm as the hum, the air thick enough that breathing felt like swallowing. I could see the names on the ledger even through the frost coating it, dozens of them, dates spanning 4 decades, and beneath the noise, underneath the layered chorus, I understood that every one of those names was still in there somewhere, still waiting, still being fed a slow, patient trickle of new grief every time the directorate's containment failed and someone new got pulled in close enough to add their voice to the chorus. I pressed the disruptor against the ledger and activated it, and the sound that came out wasn't an explosion, it was closer to a held breath finally being released, a pressure dropping all at once, the hum splintering into something that for one unbearable second sounded like every one of those names screaming individually instead of together, and then, just as suddenly, silence. Real silence. The kind Ashgrove hadn't held in that corridor for 50 years. I don't fully remember getting back through the blast doors. Kessler told me later I was found sitting against the outer wall of D-Wing, disruptor still clutched in my hand, unresponsive for almost 4 minutes before I started answering questions, and that the reading on my own containment suit had spiked high enough during those 4 minutes that they genuinely didn't know which way it was going to go. What I remember is Bree, back in that observation room 2 days later, blinking at Kessler with confusion instead of that soft, unhurried smile, asking where she was and why her hands hurt. Memory of the incident itself gone entirely, though Kessler warned me gently that full psychological recovery, if it came at all, would take years rather than weeks. Walter Higgs didn't recover. He's still in directorate care, Kessler told me, though the phrase he repeats now has changed, just slightly, from, "it came from beneath and it wants to grow," to "it's quiet now," which nobody in that program has decided yet whether to call progress or something worse. Bracewell's program didn't shut down. I want to be honest about that too, because a story like this doesn't get a clean ending just because one anchor point in one facility got disrupted. Bergstrom's article ran 3 weeks later, heavily lawyered, stripped of half the names and most of the specifics, framed publicly as a story about unexplained personnel incidents and inadequate state oversight, rather than what it actually was, and within a month the directorate had quietly relocated its most sensitive operations 2 states away, out of any jurisdiction Idrissi's office had authority over. Ashgrove's D-Wing was permanently sealed and demolished the following spring, poured over with concrete and reclassified as unsafe legacy infrastructure, and Warden Nakamura took early retirement before anyone could ask her the harder questions Idrissi eventually got clearance to ask. I don't know how many other wings like it are still standing in other states, under other facilities, feeding other quiet research programs nobody outside a very small circle is allowed to name. Bracewell told me once, near the end, that the number was classified even from him, and I've never decided whether I believe that, or whether it's simply the version of the truth that's easiest for both of us to live with. I work for the directorate now, 8 months out from that morning, doing exactly the kind of containment consulting Bracewell first offered me, because once you've walked that corridor and come back with most of yourself intact, apparently that makes you valuable in a way normal life can't unmake. I visit Bree once a month, in the ordinary rehabilitation facility she's finally been allowed to move into, and most days now she remembers my name before I've finished saying hers, though there are still mornings, she's told me honestly, where she wakes up certain she's forgotten something warm and important, and can't say what. I hear the hum sometimes, faint and layered, in ordinary silence, in empty stairwells, in the pause after a phone rings and nobody answers, and Kessler tells me that's likely permanent, a resonance fragment, the same kind Higgs carries, just smaller, quieter, mine. I don't know how many other ledgers are bolted into other walls in other decommissioned wings right now, humming, patient, waiting for someone tired enough or lonely enough to stop fighting it. That's the sentence I fall asleep to most nights, And some mornings I wake up and I'm not entirely sure whether the humming I hear is memory or something closer. Yesterday I learned what a code white lockdown means. I live with it every day now, and God help me, some quiet part of me still wouldn't trade it back. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.